Hey team, Ben Lawless here. I want to talk to you about what I'm calling the developmental learning journey, which is where you go from bad rubrics to good rubrics through to progressions and then reporting on progress. Good times. Just want to include this great quote from Ron Richard. Very famous educator. I'm going to cite, and I was in his last book randomly. Anyway, moving on. So, the Education Act 2013 says that we're supposed to report to parents on progress and achievement, but we report on achievement and we really don't make a good fist of reporting on progress because we don't have a good multi-year map with which to report progress through. I'm not a big believer that reporting just current achievement is hugely helpful to learning. We should be getting students to compare themselves to themselves at an earlier point in time rather than each other. You probably need to know a couple of pieces of terminology for the rest of this to make sense. The big point to make there is that a theoretical progression is just teachers theorising how hard they think different skills are. An empirical progression is backing up that theory with data. It makes your progression way better. So these are the stages. You make rubrics, developmental rubrics, You make a single task theoretical progression, which is just by working out how difficult the criteria are relative to each other. Then you do that for the whole year. Then you can validate that with data, and then you can report progress through those stages. So, developmental rubrics, first stage. So, I'm just going to skip through this because I've got developmental rubric writing instructional videos elsewhere. So here's a rubric, not written according to developmental principles. Watch me change it. Changing all of the skills to verbs. Removing the ambiguous language. Removing steps in a process. Making sure there's only one idea per criteria. Removing the jargon. Removing the counting. And removing the negative language. And there we go. A much improved rubric. So that is a developmental rubric. A lot of benefits for it. I'm going to skip over this. I'm sure you know how to read. Feel free to pause it if you need to. But there are some challenges when you're making good rubrics. Do teachers buy into the method of developmental rubric writing? Are they any good at it? And, writing good rubrics often is benefited from having teachers who are good at working together. Now let's turn that rubric into a single task theoretical progression. That's just a really fancy term for a pairwised rubric. So you got your rubric. Now, with this rubric, we are saying that difficulty goes up within each column, but we're not making any claims about difficulty between them, right? It's not the case that everything at step 1 is the same difficulty. Yeah, these things are not the same difficulty. These things are not the same difficulty. These things aren't. It definitely goes harder and harder and harder upwards. So how do we deal with that problem? We go something like this. Melbourne Uni teachers doing this with post-its, but you can do it on Excel pretty easily. So we look at the different criteria and we look at them together. Do we go, are these two as hard as each other? Yeah, roughly, leave that at the same level. What about these two? Are these equal difficulty? Yeah, cool, leave that. Next one, no, that's slightly harder. We'll move that one up. Booyah, lock it in, Eddie. So those ones are there. Then we put the next ones in. These are just the criteria from that original rubric. I'm just leveling them. Is describe specific details as hard or harder than using keywords? It's harder. I'm going to put it up there. Describing how they felt, writing clear sentences. Writing clear sentences is harder for sure. And you just continue that process until you've got all your criteria leveled. Yeah. So now we are saying the criteria at level 1 are the same difficulty, the criteria at level 2 are the same difficulty, and so on. Here's an example of a pairwise I did for the department using post-its. This one was going left to right. So I'm sitting there. It's called a pairwise comparison because you're comparing pairs of criteria. Great man bun. I'll move on. Anyway, the point about this developmental learning journey is that even if you only do the first stage, developmental rubrics, it's going to be an improvement. So you don't need to get all the way to the end and report on progress to have made some improvement in the way that you assess. What are the benefits of that rubric with the pairwise? All these benefits. Feel free to pause if you want to read that in more detail. There are some challenges though. Now, if we show students flat rubrics that don't have the holes in them, and then the ones that are leveled that look like they got holes, some people might find that distracting. Honestly, I think the easiest way, if you're going to use this, is just to introduce the rubrics already leveled so the students are used to seeing gaps in them. And obviously, that's always a concern. Right, so you've got your pairwise rubric. What now? Just do the exact same process with every single rubric for the whole year. So imagine that's a rubric for one task. There's a rubric for another task. It's also been leveled. It looks something like that. And this is where the fun begins. You can add levels. So maybe we're going to call that step 1, 2, 3. I'm calling the top one is 2 rows as a step. It's an art form, not a science. I just have called that one step, even though there's 2 levels of difficulty because there's not a lot of criteria between the 2. Anyway, now this is where it gets fun. You can write level statements. You can write statements saying what students at that level typically do. So like the mental models that they operate under at that level. This is also, you can assess students just against the level statements. Right? You know, if you assess them against the rubric, that's fine. That's more complex, takes a bit more time. You get more high quality. The data is more detailed, but if you want to just briefly assess them against one of these levels, you can do that as well. And this is where the use of zones of proximal development comes in, right? That's a zone of proximal development. So if you had a student who's in ZPD 1, you'd give them activities to develop their skills in that area. ZPD 2, ZPD 3, and so on. And you could have groups of students who are in ZPD 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. It's not the case that fixed ability groups is a really good method of teaching though, so there's all different ways to do it. A common way that I do is to have skills booklets that get progressively harder and students work through it that way. This is really beneficial for working out the sequence with which you should teach stuff. So if you've got, 8 different skills, you might think, I don't know, in which order should I teach which thing? Once you've done this giant pairwise comparison and compared the criteria, then that gives you some direction. This all comes from my old boss, Patrick Griffin, and his insight was to combine the theories of 3 different people. So Robert Glaser said you could describe increasing sophistication in demonstration of a skill, for example that. Rash said a student's true ability lies where they can do something roughly half the time. Yeah, so in this form of assessment, we're trying to find out if the student can do it, not whether they do it every single time. And then Vygotsky, obviously, he's the person that said that point where you can do it about half the time, that's your zone of proximal development. Patrick combined those 3 things. That's why he pushed pedagogy and assessment on. The benefits of those single year progressions. So many benefits. Leaders getting quite a few benefits. There's obviously a few challenges. Writing level statements is hard. Don't deny that. Level statements should not just be all of the criteria at that level combined together. And then obviously you need to be looking at the whole year at once. Now, to massively improve that theoretical progression, the hypothesized progression, you can verify it with evidence. That's why it's called empirical. Empiricism comes from, it's a phrase in philosophy. Anyway, an empirical progression is a progression that's backed up with data. So, for example, here's our hypothesized progression. We're going to give each of the criteria a number. That's useful for when you record of to be able to do what I'm about to show you, you would need to be recording all of, a whole cohort's worth of rubric data in a spreadsheet so you can play around with it. So say, for example, I assess 100 students on this progression. And these numbers in red tell me how often each criteria was awarded. The more often it was awarded, the easier it is, right? So in this example, those bottom criteria are all obviously right. Everyone in the class could do them, so they're the easiest. And then we keep going. And this is how often each criteria was awarded. Yeah? Only 5 students was able to use history concepts correctly. Now, I'm just going to take the words out for a second. Now I can use the data to improve what I thought was the relative difficulty. Yeah. At the moment, the numbers in yellow that stand for the criteria, how high they were, how difficult they were, was just me and some other teachers hypothesizing it. It was just using what we think we know about the subject. But we've backed it up with data now, so it will change slightly, right? So 6.1 turned out it was easier than we thought. Everyone did that, so we'll move that down to the bottom one. 1.3 was harder. Only 10 people got that, so we're going to move that up to the top level. 1.2 was a bit harder. We're going to move that up, and so on. So you're going to move it around a wee bit. And what you'll see is that that's now better than the theoretical progression. It's an empirical progression. It's been backed up by data. And now we can add the steps back in again, which are your ZPDs. So there's lots of benefits of that. There are some challenges. That being the big one. How good are your teachers at being able to fiddle around with the data to do what I just did? And then the final stage, utopia, reporting on progress, right? So instead of giving students meaningless letters or numbers, you tell them, on the report you put the steps. These are statements saying what students can do. That's where the student was in semester 2, 2018. They went up 1 step in 1 semester, and then in the next semester went up 2 steps. Now, I've now told parents and students, I've given them detailed feedback saying what the student can do. Not how they compare to anybody else, not some meaningless, impossible to interpret letter or number, but an actual statement saying what they can do. And if you wanted, you could include the average. I wouldn't, but whatever. Benefits of reporting on progress. I would love to see schools moving to reporting on progress in this method. It's my life goal to get someone there. There are some challenges. That is a big one. New Zealand has moved to a system kind of like this in NCEA in their final 2 years of schooling, and when it first got introduced, people freaked out because it didn't, in your final school reporting, it didn't say what the student had failed at. And so, bizarrely, because we seem to have this compulsion to see school assessment as judgmental and often negatively judgmental. But anyway, I don't believe that we should pander to parental preferences. Instead, we should educate them about better ways to assess and tell them what their children can do. This is a big one, though. It's not usually the case that your school's LMS will be able to show the information in that way. Most school LMS creators are like data nerds, not educators. Very few of these companies have got education experts on staff. I know we've interviewed most of them, and I've asked them prickly questions about this stuff, and they don't have the foggiest what I'm talking about. Anyway, so that journey was those stages. So my challenge to you, let's get rid of our perverse obsession with recording current achievement only. We can do that by reporting on progress rather than just achievement. Thanks heaps. Keep it real.